Occasionally, a single individual's existence unfolds in a manner so utterly beyond belief, it defies logic. This is the saga of a 19th-century Scottish firebrand whose audacious maneuvers proved pivotal in toppling Napoleon. A man who became a celebrated revolutionary icon across Chile, Peru, and Brazil, yet whose unrelenting grit turned every commanding officer he encountered into a bitter adversary. Welcome to our documentary chronicling Lord Thomas Cochrane, the most formidable and unpredictable sea captain to ever grace the age of sail. Ansfield, Scotland, served as the birthplace of Thomas Cochrane on July 28, 1775. Born to Anna Cochrane and Archibald, the 9th Earl of Dundonald. Direct lineage is traced back to a 9th-century Viking raider by the Cochranes, a lowland clan whose very name stems from an ancient Gaelic portmanteau signifying the roar of battle. A storied tradition of military devotion to the British Crown was maintained by the family. Clan members were found fighting and falling in the War of Spanish Succession, serving as staunch loyalists throughout the Jacobite Rebellion, and even participating in the New World's French and Indian Wars, leading to the affectionate moniker, the Fighting Cochranes, being bestowed upon them. While the young Thomas yearned to uphold the family's martial heritage by commissioning into the Navy, he was instead forced into the King's 104th Regiment by his father. Army life, specifically the suffocating dress requirements, was loathed by the young Scot, who reflected in his memoirs that his hair was smeared with a foul mixture of candle grease and flour, while his neck was trapped in a rigid leather stock. Driven to his breaking point, Cochrane retreated to his father, pleading for a life at sea rather than another moment in the infantry. This marked the initial instance of Cochrane's characteristic rebellion against authority, establishing a pattern that would persist for the duration of his days. Cochrane finally entered the Royal Navy as a midshipman in 1793, a transition facilitated largely by aristocratic leverage. At 17, he was significantly more mature than the typical midshipman. But this delayed start was compensated for by his relentless work ethic. He mastered every technical detail of seamanship, while his keen intellect and innate command presence left a lasting impression on his superiors. Conflict was simmering across the English Channel, just as Cochrane's naval journey commenced. As King Louis XVI had been executed during the Revolution, and war was subsequently declared by the fledgling French Republic against the European monarchies. Thus, the bulk of Cochrane's career was shaped by the ensuing struggle against the French and their Spanish allies. Promotion to acting lieutenant occurred during his initial 2 years of duty aboard the 38-gun frigate HMS Thetis, where American merchantmen destined for French ports were frequently intercepted by the crew along the eastern seaboard. By 1798, following 4 years of North American service, Britain was returned to by Cochrane. The European theater had grown increasingly perilous as Napoleon Bonaparte, a Corsican artillery specialist, climbed through the chaos of the Revolution to become a general who was currently dismantling British alliances. With Bonaparte's sights fixed on an invasion of the British Isles, the Royal Navy's maritime supremacy was the sole barrier to his success. Simultaneously, legendary status was being achieved by other British mariners like Horatio Nelson, an atmosphere that only served to sharpen the Scotsman's hunger for personal renown. Cochrane's noble pedigree secured him a post as 8th lieutenant on the HMS Barfleur, the Mediterranean Fleet's flagship under Acting Admiral Lord Keith. For nearly a year, a Spanish fleet of 20 warships was successfully blockaded in Cadiz by Cochrane's squadron. However, resentment was harbored by many of his contemporaries due to the rapid pace of his advancement. Head-to-head conflict broke out between the young officer and the Barfleur's first lieutenant, Philip Beaver, after Cochrane was reportedly reprimanded for a late return from shore leave. Provoked by his own arrogance, Cochrane argued that his tardiness was solely due to a necessary change of mud-caked attire. an act of insubordination that led to a court-martial. Despite being offered a chance to apologize, the olive branch was rejected by Cochrane, and although he was eventually cleared by Lord Keith, the victory was Pyrrhic, as the admiral's permanent displeasure had been earned. The Mediterranean fleet was ordered to Italy in January 1800 to link up with Horatio Nelson. And while docked in Sicily, Britain's most celebrated admiral was finally encountered by Cochrane. A succinct piece of guidance was imparted by Nelson. Never mind maneuvers. Always go at them. A philosophy embraced wholeheartedly by the Scot. Following a successful mission, delivering a captured French frigate to Fort Mahon, a task nearly thwarted by a violent gale, Cochrane was promoted and granted command of the HMS Speedy. The Speedy, however, was a lackluster vessel, a cramped sloop armed with tiny 4-pounder cannons that Cochrane disparagingly likened to blunderbusses. His living quarters were so restricted that standing upright was nearly impossible, an assignment likely intended as a slight by Lord Keith to bury the insolent Cochrane in a minor post. If obscurity was the goal, the plan failed spectacularly. As the path to legendary status was paved, once Thomas Cochrane assumed command, immediate success was found by the HMS Speedy starting April 22, 1800. Only a month into his first voyage, a French privateer was seized by Cochrane off Callao. Within a single season, 3 more ships were taken, a streak that temporarily mended his reputation with his superiors. Yet these initial victories were viewed as mere trifles by Cochrane, whose trademark brilliance was truly showcased the following winter, while patrolling the Spanish coast. A ship appearing to be a merchantman was spotted, but upon closing the distance, the target's true nature was revealed as a heavily armed frigate. Knowing he could neither outgun nor outrun the enemy, a ruse was orchestrated by Cochrane, where the Speedy was repainted to mimic a Danish brig, and a Danish-speaking officer informed the Spaniards the ship was riddled with plague, causing the frigate to flee in terror. This was merely the first of many times that false colors would be utilized by the resourceful captain. Cochrane's tally of victories continued to mount through the following months, with deceptive tactics and the clever application of flags becoming the cornerstones of his strategy. Striking under the cover of darkness and vanishing by dawn, the Speedy's nimble frame allowed her to remain elusive, notably capturing a Spanish and French brig simultaneously by hoisting British colors at the very last second. Cochrane's notoriety grew among both his peers and his enemies. As his journals reflect, he had become a marked object for the Spanish Navy. His reputation as a volatile maverick was further solidified within high society when, during a lavish 1801 gala in Malta, Cochrane arrived dressed as a common British seaman. Entry was denied to him by the guards who viewed his attire as too low class, leading to a fierce dispute with a French officer and a subsequent duel. The next morning, the Frenchman was shot through the ribs by Cochrane, who walked away without a scratch. By late February 1801, the Mediterranean was returned to by Cochrane, and business as usual resumed for the HMS Speedy, as the shipping lanes of Napoleon in Spain were once again targeted. By May 6, 1801, 17 ships had already been neutralized by the Speedy. But while cruising near Barcelona, a formidable shadow appeared on the horizon. The El Gamo, a massive Xebec-class Spanish frigate, had been specifically sent to terminate the Speedy's reign of terror. The gravity of the situation was clear to Cochrane. He was facing a juggernaut equipped with 32 heavy cannons and 319 men, while the Speedy possessed only 14 light guns and a skeleton crew of 54 within the mind of the bold Scotsman. The maxim of Admiral Nelson resonated. Never mind maneuvers, always go at them. Directives were issued by Cochrane for his sailors to hoist the stars and stripes and steer a direct course for the Gamo. Because the Spaniards were loath to trigger a diplomatic crisis by opening fire on a potentially neutral ship, they paused. This hesitation enabled Cochrane to draw so near the Gamo that the very whites of the enemy crew's eyes were visible to him. Once the Speedy's yardarm became entangled with the Gamo's rigging, the game was up. Cochrane gave the signal to let fly. The Union Jack was run up the mast, and a ferocious broadside was discharged by the Speedy at point-blank range. Due to the high elevation of her cannons, the first volley raked the Spanish deck with destruction, claiming the life of the Gamo's captain instantly. The Speedy was positioned so closely that the opponent's heavy guns fired harmlessly above her low-profile deck. Similarly, the veteran British crew proved to be an elusive target for ineffective Spanish musket fire. On 2 occasions, boarding maneuvers were attempted by the Spaniards, but both times the Speedy veered out of reach and answered with further broadsides. Realizing the moment for the final blow had arrived, Cochrane remarked, "Our rigging being cut up and the Speedy's sails riddled with shot. I told the men that they must either take the frigate or be themselves taken." Consequently, the Speedy was latched onto the Gamo once more, and Cochrane had his men blacken their faces with soot to project a more ghoulish appearance. The frigate was then stormed by the British from both bow and stern, sparking a chaotic melee of axes, pistols, and cutlasses with Cochrane at the heart of the fray, acting on his feet. The daring leader commanded his men to haul down the Spanish colors fluttering above the mainmast. This acted as a devastating psychological blow to the Spaniards, who now assumed their own officers had surrendered the vessel and laid down their weapons. The Gamo was seized as a prize and navigated back to Fort Mahon. Following this triumph, the Speedy persisted in her trail of havoc. An incredible 53 enemy vessels had been sunk, grounded, or captured by her by July 1801, cementing her reputation as the terror of the Mediterranean. Nevertheless, a conclusion must be reached for every saga. Ultimately, 3 massive French ships of the line, each bristling with over 70 cannons, were required to corner and capture the tiny sloop off the Alicante coast. Cochrane was brought aboard one of the warships, the Defied, where his sword was offered to the French captain. In a gesture of professional respect, the Frenchman refused the blade, noting that he would not accept the sword of an officer against whom he had struggled so unsuccessfully for so many hours. Cochrane was treated with great hospitality by his captors, specifically noting the high regard in which he was held by French Admiral Charles-Alexandre Lenoir, who frequently sought his perspective on naval matters. The British setback at the Battle of Algeciras was observed by Cochrane from the deck of the Defied before he was eventually sent to Gibraltar following a prisoner swap. On July 18, 1801, Thomas Cochrane stood on the deck of the 80-gun HMS Pompey to face a court-martial for the loss of the Speedy, however. He was confident that the string of improbable triumphs achieved by his little sloop outweighed the price of her eventual capture. As expected, an honorable acquittal was handed down to Cochrane. With the trial behind him, a return to the lucrative glory of the Napoleonic Wars was anticipated, along with a shiny new frigate and a swift promotion to post-captain. Unfortunately, these expectations went unfulfilled. The Royal Navy leadership dragged their feet, and Cochrane watched for 3 months as junior rivals were promoted over him. Although the rank of post-captain was finally granted on August 8th, a deep-seated resentment toward the Admiralty had taken root. Cochrane publicly slammed Lord Admiral St. Vincent, a move that secured the lasting enmity of the aristocratic circles governing British naval command. War against Napoleonic France was once again declared by Britain on May 18, 1803. Having spent a year of peace and unemployment, Cochrane was thrilled to be sent back into the fray. Unfortunately, his past outbursts returned to haunt him. As the vengeful Lord St. Vincent ensured the new post-captain was shortchanged yet again. Command of the HMS Arab was assigned to Cochrane, a dilapidated sixth-rate frigate he compared to a flat-bottomed barge rather than a proper warship. famously grumbling that she would sail like a haystack. Relegated to patrolling northern Europe for the next year, the assignment was described by Cochrane as literally naval exile in a tub. However, in May 1804, St. Vincent was ousted by Lord Melville, who possessed a greater affinity for Cochrane's record. By autumn, a vessel equal to his skill was placed under his command, the HMS Pallas. This Thames-class frigate was a pristine, top-tier fifth-rate armed with 36 guns, compared to the Speedy. Her deck was nearly twice the length, and her crew capacity was tripled. The Pallas was a razor-sharp instrument of war by the start of 1806. The HMS Pallas had transformed into a notorious threat to both Spain and France. During a single sweep of the Azores, 4 Spanish galleons brimming with New World silver were intercepted by her, stripping millions of dollars from the Spanish treasury. Cochrane was then moved to the waters of the Bay of Biscay, where a dozen additional French ships were harassed by his crew. The most remarkable exploit of the Pallas occurred on April 5, 1806. Intelligence reached Cochrane regarding a cluster of French corvettes moored in the Garonne River estuary. Because the coastline and water conditions were unsuitable for a direct confrontation, Cochrane waited for dusk and anchored his frigate at the river's mouth. From there, Lieutenant John Haswell was tasked with taking 180 men in boarding boats to row upriver under the veil of night. This raiding party happened upon the Tapajous, a 14-gun corvette guarding the other vessels further inshore. At 3 a.m., the Pallas crew fell upon the Tapajous, catching the French defenders completely off guard. The British sailors won a brief but violent struggle, forcing the enemy to strike their colors. However, the situation soon took a turn for the worse, as the clamor of musket fire had alerted the ships further up the river. Before Lieutenant Haswell could weigh anchor and return the prize to the Pallas, his team was cut off by another French gun brig. A firefight between the vessels broke out, during which the captured ship's guns were used by Haswell to overcome the foe. Despite the victory, the prize ship's rigging was wrecked, leaving the bulk of the British sailors stranded upriver at dawn. The remaining skeleton crew on the Pallas sighted 3 French corvettes closing in from the coast. Cochrane was now in a precarious position, as the majority of his complement was still with Haswell. While the Pallas might outgun 3 corvettes at full strength, a battle with only 40 men on deck was a losing prospect. Thinking on his feet, Cochrane commanded his few sailors to secure rope yarns to the furled sails. Then, in a single coordinated movement, the yarns were severed, causing the sails to drop all at once and creating the illusion of a fully manned ship. In the words of Cochrane, the maneuver succeeded to a marvel. No sooner was our cloud of canvas thus suddenly let fall than the approaching vessels hauled the wind and ran off along shore. The Pallas gave chase, hammering bow guns into the stern of the leading fugitive. These were the only cannons the small crew could operate, a fact unknown to the French captain, who grounded his vessel in a panic. The impact toppling the mainmast, with one foe neutralized, the other 2 corvettes were pursued relentlessly by the predatory Cochrane. Choosing to wreck their ships rather than engage the Pallas, both ran aground. In total, 4 French warships were disabled, and 1 was captured by Cochrane using just a single frigate and a few boats. It was a staggering, lopsided victory forged by quick thinking and nerves of steel. In the summer of 1806, Cochrane returned to Britain as a celebrated hero of the war, his daring incursions in the Bay of Biscay having brought him significant renown. Napoleon himself, the newly minted Emperor of France, took notice of the trail of ruin left by this prolific captain and ordered his apprehension, dubbing him La Loupe de Mers, the Sea Wolf, far from being finished with his maritime raids. Cochrane was never one to settle. In August 1806, he was given command of the HMS Imperius, a robust 38-gun frigate far more potent than the Pallas. The Imperios quickly became a symbol of British naval pride and a persistent nightmare for France. Cochrane truly found his rhythm in 1808 while operating off the Spanish coast. This was a period when the British Army was locked in a grueling land campaign across the Iberian Peninsula, and the war effort was bolstered significantly by Cochrane's naval operations. The impact of his work was highlighted by the novelist Sir Walter Scott, who observed that the captain's lone ship had kept the whole coast of Languedoc in alarm, destroyed vital French communication lines to prevent reinforcements from entering Spain, and sowed such chaos that 2,000 soldiers were diverted to face him, troops who would have otherwise been deployed deeper into the peninsula. Despite these achievements, Cochrane continued to fume over the lack of acclaim from the Admiralty, frequently asserting in his life story that he was not only denied credit, but that he and his men were swindled out of their hard-earned prize money. In June, the Imperios set a course for Montgat, a fortress in Catalonia, currently occupied by the troops of General Duchesne. A successful two-pronged raid on the shoreline battery was executed by Cochrane, with the assistance of local Catalan partisans. His momentum continued as French codebooks were seized and decrypted and Fort Trinidad was occupied, a series of events that inflicted devastating blows to the enemy's intelligence, manpower, and clockwork logistics, to allies and adversaries alike. The Sea Wolf was no longer viewed as a mere mortal, but rather a vengeful phantom of the tides. It was this very aura of invincibility that led to his recruitment for the most massive fleet confrontation of his career, the Battle of Basque Roads, clash that would represent the zenith of his naval audacity and the ultimate tipping point of his pride. A Royal Navy armada was being rapidly mobilized in the spring of 1809 by Admiral Gambier to tackle a French squadron that had slipped through the blockade at Brest. These ships were now tucked away in the well-defended estuary of the River Charente, a location known as Basque Roads, because the French intended to break for the Atlantic to disrupt British interests in the West Indies. The British leadership determined this could not be tolerated. Consequently, the Admiralty reached out to their most fearless post captain, while a gamble was taken by using such a volatile maverick. The total annihilation of the French Atlantic Fleet required exactly the kind of naval brilliance and raw courage that Cochrane possessed. Cochrane was summoned to the Palace of Whitehall by First Admiral Lord Mulgrave to provide his expert input. The Scotsman posited that the use of fireships would only be effective if they were paired with vessels packed with rockets and explosives to shatter any French resistance. Impressed by this strategy, Mulgrave commanded Cochrane to link up with Gambier's fleet and personally spearhead the fireship assault. This development troubled Cochrane, as Admiral Gambier was loathed by him. He saw the man as the quintessential corrupt blue blood who had spent years stifling his career. Despite the captain's protests, Mulgrave would not back down, and the Imperios was reluctantly sailed to join the British battle group. Upon his arrival at Basque Roads on April 3rd, Cochrane's low opinion of Gambier was immediately validated. The commander was a hesitant, vacillating man and evangelical who preferred forcing his sailors to study religious pamphlets rather than drilling them for the coming fight. The friction was only worsened by Cochrane's appointment as the strike leader. Admiral Sir Eliab Harvey, the captain of the HMS Temeraire and a legend of Trafalgar, was livid at being passed over for a junior officer. Gambier was denounced by Harvey as a mere psalm slinger, with the veteran declaring that he had never seen anyone so poorly suited for command. Harvey even asserted that had Nelson been present, the enemy would have been engaged instantly rather than being left to sit. For these outbursts, Harvey was sent back to London for a court-martial, an exit that served as a dark omen for the fleet. A 9-mile gap separated the two fleets in a tense, indefinite stalemate, the French line, consisting of 11 ships of the line and 4 frigates, was overseen by Admiral Zachary Allemand. These vessels were arranged in double rows, pinned between the treacherous Boyard Shoal and the small Isle d'Aix. Additionally, the French flanks were protected by a fortified garrison with active gun batteries on the island's northern tip, making them virtually unreachable by British ships. Recognizing that the clock was ticking, Cochrane requested and received permission to transform Gambier's transport vessels into floating bombs. 3 explosion ships were outfitted, their hulls crammed with 1,500 barrels of gunpowder and 3,000 grenades. A long fuse was rigged to the stern, providing the volunteer crew a 15-minute window to escape via lifeboat before the blast. By April 10th, 8 more fireships provided by Lord Melville had arrived. With his lethal squadron of suicide vessels ready, Cochrane pushed Gambier for the green light to charge the French lines. The request was denied by Gambier, who dismissed Cochrane's aggressive plan as reckless. This infuriated the Scotsman, who argued that any further stalling would allow Admiral Allemand to sniff out the trap and bolster his defenses, thereby costing British lives. Indeed, the following dawn revealed that a massive floating boom had been constructed to block the channel. Allemand had indeed been tipped off about the fireships. He ordered his front line to face forward to present a smaller profile and deployed 70 rowboats to the boom to tow away any incoming threats. French frigates were also positioned ahead of the fleet to protect the harbor's entrance. As the sun set on April 11th, the weather took a turn for the worse, with the winds whipping the sea into a choppy frenzy. It was under these punishing conditions that Gambier finally greenlit the attack, perhaps hoping the storm would humble Cochrane. However, the Sea Wolf remained undeterred and forged ahead with his plan. Because fireships operated outside the civilized rules of engagement, his crew was composed entirely of volunteers who knew they would be executed rather than imprisoned if captured. Initially, the Imperios, Pallas, Eagle, and Unicorn were anchored at the edge of the Boyard Shoal to recover the crews of the kamikaze ships. The battle began under the cover of night. Lanterns were lit by the sloops Red Pole and Lyra to mark the channel for the incoming strike. Around 8 p.m., 3 explosive ships utilized the flood tide to barrel toward the French boom. One was under the command of Frederick Marryat, while the lead vessel was steered by Cochrane himself. By roughly 8:30 p.m., Cochrane realized his floating mine was within 10 minutes of impact. His crew was ordered to the lifeboats immediately, and the fuse was personally sparked by the captain. As they rowed desperately against the tide to escape the blast radius, it was discovered that their pet dog had been left behind. Refusing to abandon his companion to the flames, Cochrane rowed back to the time bomb, boarded it to retrieve the dog, and leaped back into the dinghy. Shortly thereafter, the boom was struck, and the night was split open by a colossal eruption, a true fireworks display of carnage. The explosive ship was vaporized, and the massive chain meant to stop the British was shredded. 10 minutes later, a second blast was triggered by Marryat's vessel, scattering the French rowboats that had been waiting to intercept them. Admiral Allemand was left speechless by this devastation. While he had expected fireships, the use of explosive infernal machines was seen as a monstrous violation of naval convention. Although the third explosive ship was lost to a shoal, the path was wide open for the fire attack to begin. At 9:30 p.m., 20 British fireships were sent down the channel. The French frigate screen panicked and cut their anchors to flee toward the main fleet. However, the fireships soon struggled with the turbulent waters. Many captains lost their nerve, lighting and abandoning their vessels too early, which caused the hulks to drift uselessly into the mud. Conversely, the storm also hindered the French, making any defensive maneuvering impossible. 4 fireships successfully breached the French anchorage, and total chaos was unleashed. A flaming vessel became snagged on the 74-gun Regulus, forcing it to collide with the Tourville as rockets screamed across the wooden decks. Multiple ships were engulfed. Men chose to drown rather than burn, creating a scene of absolute terror. Daylight revealed that of the 14 French vessels, all but 2 had been damaged and run aground on the mudflats in their desperate bid to escape the fire. They were sitting ducks, and Cochrane, having returned to the Imperios, knew the moment to strike had arrived. Yet, the order to attack was withheld by Admiral Gambier. Cochrane was floored by this refusal. He could not grasp how a man with 11 battleships would hesitate to finish off an enemy with only 2 working ships. By noon, several French ships, including the Ocean, had been refloated and were retreating deeper into the river Charente. Realizing the chance for a total victory was vanishing, an act of blatant insubordination was committed by Cochrane. He sailed the Imperios into the Gulf alone to engage the entire French fleet. As he later put it, he would rather risk his ship and his career than allow the Admiralty's expectations to end in such a disgraceful fashion. The Imperios locked horns with the grounded Calcutta, engaging in a ferocious exchange of broadsides that saw the British frigate hold a crushing advantage. Simultaneously, Cochrane directed his bow and stern guns to hammer the Aquilon and the Ville de Varsovie. Despite being stuck on the mudflats, these 3 ships of the line were double the size of the lone frigate that dared to duel them. Before long, the Calcutta struck her colors and was seized by Cochrane's boarding party. Recognizing that he could no longer let a single headstrong captain face the entire French fleet alone, Gambier finally dispatched reinforcements into the channel. 2 ships of the line and 5 frigates surged into Basque roads. While the Calcutta was put to the torch and abandoned, the Aquilon and Ville de Varsovie quickly surrendered to the British. A 4th vessel, the Tonnerre, was blown up by her own crew to prevent capture without question. A resounding victory was secured by the Royal Navy at the Battle of Basque Roads, resulting in the loss of 3 French ships of the line, a 4th rate, and a frigate, all while suffering only 30 casualties and losing 0 ships. However, Cochrane remained convinced that had Gambier displayed an ounce of grit, the total destruction of the French Atlantic fleet could have been achieved that morning. Instead, the bulk of the enemy force lived to fight another day. Infuriated by such incompetence, Cochrane returned to England and dragged the admiral's character through the mud. While defying authority was second nature to him, never before had he unleashed such a venomous personal assault on a figure so high-ranking and well-insulated. To clear his name, a court-martial was insisted upon by Gambier. Naturally, the panel was packed with sympathetic aristocrats who cleared the admiral of all charges, while a devastating blow was dealt to Cochrane's reputation for his perceived arrogance. This fallout drove Cochrane to reject further naval commissions, and from 1809, his focus shifted entirely to his role as a member of Parliament since 1806, when he was first elected to represent Honiton and later Westminster. Political power had been chased by Cochrane alongside his naval duties. This platform was utilized to spearhead radical naval reforms and become the primary whistleblower against the deep-seated corruption of the Admiralty. Over the ensuing years, Cochrane's popularity soared among the common folk as he waged a relentless war against the ruling class. However, in the halls of Parliament and the Admiralty, he found himself almost entirely without allies. In 1814, Cochrane was caught in the crosshairs of a massive stock market scandal, accused of orchestrating a hoax regarding Napoleon's death to pump the value of his government bonds. Despite his fierce protestations of innocence, his pleas were ignored by a court likely controlled by the very enemies he had spent years antagonizing. As a consequence of the alleged fraud, Cochrane was stripped of his honors, kicked out of Parliament, and dishonorably discharged from the Royal Navy, the very service he had brought so much glory to. A 12-month prison sentence followed, and the Sea Vols chapter seemed to close within the grim walls of King's Bench prison. By 1815, the war that had served as the backdrop for Cochrane's entire career ended with Napoleon's defeat at Waterloo. Yet, the disgraced Scotsman was barred from the celebrations, left instead to languish in a cell. True to his nature, Cochrane refused to stay put, escaping from King's Bench in March 1815 by rappelling down a 3-story wall with smuggled rope, rather than making a run for it. He marched straight to Westminster and occupied the seat in the House of Commons he believed was still rightfully his. Naturally, he was hauled away by police and tossed back behind bars. Upon completing his time in June, a reunion with his family finally occurred. During his years of turmoil, a wife named Kitty had been wed by Cochrane, and a son, Thomas Jr., had been born to them in 1818. Cochrane was approached by Don José Alvarez, the London envoy for Chile at that time. Chile was a rebel territory, locked in a desperate independence struggle against Spain. In the wake of Napoleon's fall, South America was ignited by revolutionary fires, with icons like Simon Bolivar battling to forge new republics in Colombia and Bolivia, while inland Chile had been liberated by General José de San Martin and the commander Bernardo O'Higgins. The Spanish remained masters of the sea, secure in their massive coastal batteries from Peru to Patagonia. A counter-offensive was threatened by the Royalists on O'Higgins' behalf. Ambassador Alvarez begged Cochrane to take the helm of the Chilean Navy and sweep the Spanish from the Pacific. On August 15, 1818, Cochrane and his family weighed anchor for the Southern Hemisphere. Upon arriving at the docks of Valparaiso on November 29th, Cochrane was introduced to his new fleet. It was a humble force, consisting only of a few brigs, a sloop, and 3 frigates. The crown jewel was the 50-gun O'Higgins, named for the nation's leader, which was promptly claimed by Cochrane as his flagship. On January 16, 1819, the first South American expedition was launched. To his shock, it was discovered that his 5-year-old son had snuck aboard the flagship. Because they were already well underway, the boy was allowed to remain, and the crew even tailored a tiny midshipman's uniform for him. Cochrane's primary target was Callao, a Spanish stronghold where ships could find refuge behind a massive beachfront fortress. Intelligence suggested that the Esmeralda and Venganza, Spain's most formidable frigates, were moored there. Arriving in February during a local carnival, Cochrane planned to slip into the harbor while the defenders were distracted by the festivities. However, the plan was thwarted by a heavy fog that rolled into the rocky anchorage, stealing their element of surprise. When the mist finally cleared, the Chilean ships were exposed to 350 guns from the fortress, which were fully manned despite the holiday. As the Lautaro retreated, the O'Higgins was left to weather a brutal bombardment. To Cochrane's horror, his young son dashed onto the deck just as a cannonball decapitated a nearby Marine, drenching the boy in blood, frozen with fear. The father only moved when the child yelled, "I am not hurt, Papa. The ball did not touch me." The vessel was quickly steered out of range, and although Tom screamed to stay and see the fight, he was eventually allowed to watch as the ship escaped during a subsequent prisoner exchange. The Spanish viceroy questioned why a British lord would fight for a band of revolutionaries. Cochrane retorted, "A British nobleman is a free man, capable of judging between right and wrong, and at liberty to adopt a country and a cause which aim at restoring the rights of oppressed human nature." The Spaniards, vividly remembering the havoc he had wreaked 20 years prior on the HMS Speedy, were terrified. Cochrane was delighted to learn his enemies had christened him El Diablo, the Devil. Having failed to crack Callao, he set his sights on Valdivia. Although O'Higgins admired him, the Chilean leader refused to provide men or money for an assault on what was considered the most impenetrable fortress in the Americas. To attack Valdivia was viewed as a suicide mission by everyone except Cochrane. Thus, in December 1819, a Sea Wolf sailed south alone, intent on toppling the Spanish stronghold single-handedly. On January 17, 1820, the O'Higgins reached Callao Bay, an estuary guarded by 7 massive land batteries. These forts stood between Cochrane and the city, and victory was now essential to protect both his legendary status and his standing with the Chilean government. Fortuitously, the expedition was off to a flying start. By employing his signature false flag ruse, Cochrane deceptively flew Spanish ensigns while navigating the bay. The royalist brig Potrillo was promptly hoodwinked and seized when she drifted toward the shore to investigate. A sum of $20,000 and a meticulously detailed maritime chart of Valdivia's harbor were discovered aboard the captured vessel. Once a thorough reconnaissance had been finalized, the O'Higgins cruised up the coastline toward Talcahuano Bay, where a force of 250 volunteers was successfully raised by the local Chilean governor for the Sea Wolf's cause. Furthermore, 2 schooners, the Montezuma and Intrepido, were secured for service by Cochrane. The small fleet weighed anchor and headed south once more. Despite the daunting reality that 350 sailors, distributed across 3 wooden hulls, were destined to clash with 2,000 troops entrenched in 7 stone bastions, the O'Higgins managed to remain buoyant through relentless bilge pumping and Cochrane's own expertise in carpentry after a rogue gust briefly drove her aground on Curaquina Island. However, the ship was heavily compromised. The hull's flooding had completely ruined the powder magazine and the majority of the onboard munitions. Cochrane simply assured his crew that triumph would be achieved through the sheer force of their bayonets. Remaining totally unfazed by the loss, the frigate eventually linked back up with the 2 schooners. The personnel of the crippled O'Higgins were shifted to the Montezuma and Intrepido, both of which dropped anchor just outside Fort Ingalls at the River Valdivia's mouth, while displaying Spanish colors to avoid tipping off the sentries. It had been grasped by Cochrane that the bulk of the adversary's defenses were engineered to thwart a frontal maritime strike, meaning a terrestrial assault might provide a vital tactical edge, as he informed his men. When well executed, maneuvers the enemy doesn't see coming are almost certain to bear fruit. Regardless of the numerical disadvantage, on the afternoon of February 3rd, a demand for identification was issued to the 2 ships by the Spanish garrison. A parley officer was dispatched to the shore at Fort Ingalls by Cochrane, who spun a yarn about being blown off course from a Spanish squadron navigating Cape Horn. This fabrication was rejected by the Spaniards, who commenced fire on the Intrepido at exactly 4 p.m., piercing her hull and claiming 2 soldiers' lives. Cochrane was left with no choice but to trigger the immediate start of his offensive. A spearhead was organized for this purpose. 44 Marines, under the command of English Major William Miller, were loaded into a canoe to begin a hazardous approach toward the beach at Fort Ingalls. A forward unit of 75 Spanish troops was sent out to meet them, unleashing consecutive musket volleys upon the Chilean craft, though several Marines were struck down. The rowers pushed through the hail of fire with immense courage. Upon hitting the sand, the Spanish forces were rooted back into their stronghold by a ferocious bayonet charge led by Major Miller. A fragile beachhead had finally been secured. The second stage of Cochrane's strategy was set in motion as soon as night descended. Under the veil of darkness, 250 Chilean infantrymen were ferried to the beach with great speed. Guided by a prisoner of war, they scaled the craggy precipices toward the grassy plateau where the fort was perched. Once at the top, the strike team was partitioned into 2 groups. The seaward wall of Fort Ingalls was approached by the first group, who remained outside the range of fire while generating maximum noise, shouting, hollering, and discharging muskets into the air. Cochrane understood that this bluff was vital for his plan's success, since the soldiers possessed almost no usable ammunition. Meanwhile, the second group had begun a flanking maneuver toward the fort's inland side. Every sound they made was masked by the ruckus created by their comrades in front of the stronghold as they crept silently through the shadows. They lay in wait within a thicket of trees, training their sights on the preoccupied Spaniards on the seaward wall before a lethal musket volley was released using their final scraps of dry powder. In the subsequent turmoil, the Chilean troops fixed their bayonets and charged the enemy while letting out terrifying battle cries to maximize the psychological impact. Gripped by the combination of darkness, slaughter, and total confusion, the Spaniards were overcome by panic and abandoned Fort Ingalls to flee toward the adjacent Fort Carlos. They were pursued without mercy by Cochrane's troops, who ran through the terrified royalists as they retreated. As the fleeing garrison from Ingalls sprinted toward Fort San Carlos, the battery's commander hurriedly ordered the gates open to welcome the survivors. The Sea Wolf's combatants slipped right through the open entrances amidst the chaos and the cover of night, immediately beginning to cut down the Spaniards within. Once again, the two combined garrisons retreated from the second battery and bolted toward Fort Amargos. The conflict proceeded like a bizarre game of dominoes, with Fort Amargos suffering the exact same fate as San Carlos before it. Chilean soldiers managed to infiltrate the open gates intended to provide refuge for their retreating prey, ruthlessly striking at everyone inside. Despite outnumbering the Chileans 6-1, the Spaniards were completely broken by an opponent they perceived as nothing less than the devil incarnate. By the time Fort Amargos had been suppressed, 100 Spaniards lay dead, and another 100 had been taken prisoner by Cochrane's forces. The assault then moved toward Fort Corocomayo, situated on an inland hill. Unlike the previous three bastions, a modest resistance was offered by Corocomayo, though it was ultimately crushed by the ferocity of the Sea Wolf's Marines. When the sun broke on the morning of February 4th, 4 out of the 7 bastions were under Chilean control. Spanish spirits were at an all-time low, completely blindsided by this humiliating rout. A half-hearted defense was mounted by the fortresses on the eastern side of the harbor as the Montezuma and Intrepido entered the bay and opened fire. However, the final remnants of Spanish willpower evaporated when the imposing silhouette of the O'Higgins appeared near Fort Niebla. It was believed by the Royalists that Cochrane intended to bombard them using the artillery seized from Fort Corocomayo, compounded by the perceived threat of reinforcements aboard the 50-gun frigate. Further resistance was deemed pointlessly destructive. In truth, this was yet another deception, as the O'Higgins carried no extra troops and was in no condition to engage in combat. Nevertheless, Corral Bay fell entirely into Cochrane's possession as the Spaniards abandoned the eastern forts. Only 26 men were lost by him throughout the entire operation. Cochrane then pushed down the river to strike the city proper, only to discover that the Spanish governor had plundered everything of worth before fleeing with his garrison. The city of Valdivia was now officially under Chilean administration. Despite the governor's looting, significant spoils remained. Massive quantities of weaponry, ammunition, and funds were confiscated from the various forts, totaling a very promising haul. More critically, the final pocket of colonial authority in the south of the continent was extinguished with the fall of the last Spanish stronghold in Chile. This triumph effectively cemented the long-term prospects of Chilean liberty and granted them sovereignty over their coastline and southern borders. This stood as the most significant victory Lord Thomas Cochrane would ever achieve on South American soil. Cochrane subsequently made his way back to Valparaiso. It had been assumed by the Chilean administration that the Valdivia mission would end in disaster. and preparations had been made to court-martial him for insubordination. Upon discovering that he had triumphed, they quickly changed their tune, and the Scotsman's feat was publicly celebrated. Cochrane shifted his focus back north toward Peru to build on the momentum of his Valdivia victory. His sights were set specifically on the harbor at Callao, a fortress that had so far successfully resisted his efforts. On August 21, 1820, the Sea Wolf departed Valparaiso at the helm of the entire Chilean naval force, accompanied by the renowned General José de San Martin and 4,200 of his soldiers, who constituted the core of the Chilean army. Their ultimate objective was the capture of Lima, the Peruvian capital located right next to Callao. Tensions soon flared between Cochrane and San Martin. The Chilean general was unwilling to commit his troops to a full-scale strike against their primary goal. Instead, his soldiers were offloaded at various ports hundreds of miles away from both Callao and Lima, resulting in weeks of inactivity and very few results. Believing San Martin to be of mediocre military stock, Cochrane separated from the main Chilean body and sailed directly for Callao with just 3 ships, the O'Higgins, Lautaro, and Independencia, although San Martin was told that a blockade was intended to isolate Lima by sea. This was a fabrication, as a far more audacious plan was being brewed by Cochrane. The suspicion that the Spanish frigate Esmeralda remained moored at Callao had been harbored by Cochrane, and upon his arrival, those gut feelings were vindicated. Because previous attempts had proven that a direct hit on the bay's coastal batteries was a death sentence. A new strategy was required, as the most formidable Spanish man of war on the Pacific coast. The Esmeralda represented a major prize. Should a clandestine snatch and grab be executed from under the fortress guns, Royalist naval prestige in Peru would be utterly demolished. A plan, elegant in its simplicity, was devised, guided by the shadows of night. A silent raiding party would pull into the harbor aboard small launches to overwhelm the sleeping crew. The prize would then be spirited away before the shore garrison could even blink. At the stroke of midnight, the foray began as the Sea Wolf's men embarked in 14 canoes, gliding unnoticed past the neutral hulls of the British Hyperion and the American Macedonia. Upon reaching the Esmeralda, the boarding teams began scaling her sides via the main chains. A crisis point was reached when the deck watch detected the clanking of metal and sounded the alarm. With the element of surprise slipping away, Cochrane hauled himself onto the deck, only to be clubbed by a sentry's musket butt. Though he was knocked back into the skiff, he instantly lunged back at the chains to reclimb the hull. This time, the sentry was silenced by Cochrane's pistol as he vaulted onto the gangway, shouting his famous war cry, "Up, my lads! She's ours!" As Chileans swarmed the deck, the Spanish defenders were driven to the forecastle, where they managed to rally and release a desperate musket volley. Despite taking a bullet to the thigh, Cochrane surged forward until the remaining Royalists either surrendered or leaped into the dark water. The Esmeralda was finally in his grasp. By this time, the fortress had been fully roused and began raining fire down upon the captured vessel. Without missing a beat, the crew unfurled the canvas to navigate their prize out of the danger zone. In a final masterstroke of deception, Cochrane commanded that the Esmeralda's signal lights be arranged in the exact configuration used by the Hyperion and Macedonia. Because the Spaniards could not risk an international incident by sinking neutral ships, they were forced to stand by as their most powerful asset vanished into the night. West of Cape Horn, the Spanish Navy was effectively paralyzed by this loss. Now the undisputed master of the waves, Cochrane initiated a total blockade of Callao, hemmed in by land and sea. The defenders were faced with a grim choice: capitulate or starve. Within a month, the garrison defected and threw their lot in with the Chilean Republic. Meanwhile, In the trenches outside Lima, General San Martin's ground campaign had stalled. His attempts to spark a native uprising against the Spanish crown had largely fallen flat. A rift began to grow between the two leaders. As Cochrane suspected, the general was hoarding his army's strength to seize personal power once the dust settled. Frustrated by the stalemate, Cochrane's offer to lead a direct storming of Lima was rebuffed. Eventually, 600 soldiers were reluctantly handed over to him, whom he used to relentlessly harry the Spanish coast. By systematically shredding the royalist supply lines, the Sea-Wolf broke the enemy's will to resist after 3 months, leading to the city's surrender on July 28, 1821. The independence of Peru was proclaimed by San Martin as he marched into the capital. Cochrane was greeted with a hero's welcome by the citizens when he entered the liberated metropolis on July 17th. The Scotsman had traveled a weary road from his disgrace in England to reclaim his mantle as a living legend. However, this victory was haunted by the looming shadow of political friction. As Cochrane had feared, San Martin was named Supreme Protector of Peru, and the cracks in their alliance widened. San Martin's establishment of a de facto dictatorship was viewed by him as a necessary evil to prevent post-war anarchy and famine. To Cochrane, however, the general was a turncoat who had traded one form of tyranny for another. The situation was further poisoned when San Martin balked at paying the fleet, insisting it was Chile's financial burden in his trademark abrasive style. Cochrane settled the debt by intercepting and looting a schooner carrying the Peruvian state treasury, while his sailors were paid in full. This act transformed him from a liberator into a dangerous renegade in the eyes of the Peruvian government. His rigid ethics and lack of political tact had burned every bridge he had just built. Cochrane eventually returned to Valparaiso, where his reputation among the Chileans remained golden. It was there, in late 1822, that an offer was extended by a Brazilian agent named Antonio Correa da Câmara. The proposition was simple: take command of the fledgling Brazilian navy. Though he hesitated at first, the brewing civil unrest in Chile convinced him to move on. In a final stirring speech, he addressed the nation. "Chilenos, my fellow countrymen, you know that independence is purchased at the point of a bayonet. Know also that liberty is founded on good faith. Those who infringe upon these are your only enemies." With those parting words, he sailed away from the coast he had set free, much like its neighbors. Brazil was locked in a struggle against its colonial master, Portugal, though the circumstances were quite unique. Following Napoleon's invasion of the motherland in 1807, the Portuguese royals had fled to Brazil, turning the colony into the heart of the empire. When King João VI finally returned to Europe in 1815, his son Pedro was left behind to govern. When the king attempted to strip Brazil of its newfound status, the cry for rebellion went up in an unusual twist of fate. The revolution was led by Prince Pedro himself, who chose his adopted home over his royal lineage, declaring independence or death, and being crowned the nation's first emperor. Cochrane arrived in Rio de Janeiro in the spring of 1823, while the south was secure. The northern strongholds of Maranhão and Bahia remained under the Portuguese thumb. After a brief meeting with the young emperor, Cochrane inspected his new fleet, a modest but functional collection of ships, anchored by the 64-gun flagship Pedro I. In April, the Sea-Wolf was deployed north to target Salvador, the capital of Bahia and the most powerful Portuguese bastion in the region. While the city was besieged by land, the harbor was blockaded by Cochrane to choke off seaborne supplies. The reliability of his crew, however, was a source of constant anxiety. Because Brazilian sailors had been marginalized for decades, the navy was a patchwork of English mercenaries, freedmen, and resentful Portuguese nationals. While the Anglophones were dependable, the Portuguese laborers were viewed with deep suspicion, These fears were realized on May 4th, when 13 Portuguese warships appeared to break the blockade. Though outnumbered 2-1, Cochrane's instinct was to charge. As the enemy formed a battle line, the Pedro I pierced their formation, isolating 4 ships, however. When the signal was given for the rest of the Brazilian fleet to close in, disaster struck. The disgruntled Portuguese sailors on the other ships refused to engage, leaving Cochrane's flagship to face the entire enemy squadron alone. The situation turned from bad to worse when it was discovered that saboteurs were active on his own ship. 2 Portuguese workers had barricaded the powder monkeys below deck, cutting off the supply of gunpowder to the cannons. Though the conspirators were caught, the damage was done. A humiliating retreat was forced upon the Seawolf, marking a rare and unceremonious defeat. Following this massive complication, a drastic reshuffling of fleet personnel was executed by Cochrane. Englishmen, Americans, faithful Brazilians, and Black Marines were all concentrated aboard his flagship and 2 supporting frigates. With this significantly slimmed down, but far more reliable strike force, the war was proceeded with by the Scotsmen on the night of June 12th. The Pedro I was cleverly disguised as a British merchant vessel by Cochrane, who then slipped into Salvador harbor to perform reconnaissance for attack centered on his old reliable standby, the fireship. Cochrane's presence was quickly unmasked. Yet this worked in his favor, having endured a year-long siege. The inhabitants of Salvador were already at their wits' end. Upon discovering the Sea Wolf himself was prowling their seaward gates, they were paralyzed by dread. Their imaginations run wild with whatever lethal stratagem the notorious captain might have up his sleeve. With all will to fight extinguished among the populace, the Portuguese governor was begged by the townsfolk to finally evacuate the coastal bastion. On July 2, 1823, a massive convoy was assembled by the Portuguese garrison as they abandoned Bahia for good, setting sail toward their motherland with 17 warships and 75 transport vessels. One can only imagine the predatory grin that likely crept onto Cochrane's face as his quarry exposed themselves on the high seas. Unfurling his flagship's canvas, he descended upon the retreating Portuguese like a wolf among a flock of sheep. Within months, King João's maritime power was nearly eviscerated by Cochrane, who pursued them relentlessly across the Atlantic with only 3 ships, isolating and picking off the enemy one by one. By the end of the pursuit, over 30 Portuguese vessels and more than 2,000 soldiers had been captured by the Scotsman and his crews. Following this total annihilation of Portuguese naval strength, Cochrane made a move towards São Luís, the capital of Maranhão, boldly sailing within the reach of the town's shore batteries with only his flagship. His captain was sent ashore to negotiate with the local commandant. The ultimatum delivered by Cochrane was blunt. Bahia was liberated, the Portuguese fleet was destroyed, and a colossal Brazilian armada was currently bearing down on Maranhão. This was a total fabrication, as no such fleet existed. Nevertheless, the bait was swallowed hook, line, and sinker by the Portuguese garrison. The following day, Portugal was forsaken and allegiance to the Brazilian emperor was sworn by the local junta and the bishop aboard the Pedro I. Total command of the town was promptly seized by Cochrane's men, who commandeered every ship in the harbor and confiscated all munitions. A hero's welcome was once again received by Cochrane upon his return to Rio in 1824, where the non-hereditary title of Marquis of Maranhão was bestowed upon him by Emperor Pedro. That same year, the Sea Wolf helped to swiftly extinguish a new rebellion in Pernambuco, led by wealthy landowners resisting the emperor's liberal reforms. By this stage, his legacy as a foundational hero of Brazilian nationhood was cemented, mirroring his status in Chile and Peru. Unfortunately, a habit of becoming a national savior only to immediately alienate the government with his sheer stubbornness had been developed by Cochrane. And this Brazilian chapter would end just like his Spanish-American ventures. A policy of reconciliation with former Portuguese landowners was insisted upon by Emperor Pedro's administration, which involved returning property and wealth seized during the conflict. This was viewed as a personal insult by Cochrane, who had captured the modern equivalent of approximately $12 million in booty. He insisted that he and his men were rightfully owed at least 1/8 of the total haul in 1825. The situation reached a breaking point when Cochrane took matters into his own hands by plundering Brazilian merchant ships at São Luís do Maranhão and absconding with the public funds found in their holds. Although his return to Rio was demanded by an outraged Brazilian government, Cochrane had already vanished aboard a frigate, making his way back to Britain after 7 years abroad. However, this homecoming would prove to be short-lived, as his expertise was already being sought by another burgeoning nation, while Greek culture was ancient. The modern Greek state was a fledgling entity forged in the fires of revolt. Having lived under Ottoman rule for nearly 4 centuries, the Greeks rose up in 1821 and had been locked in a desperate struggle for survival ever since. Massive sympathy was evoked across Western Europe by this conflict, which many viewed as a righteous crusade against Turkish tyranny. Furthermore, the land of Socrates and Sophocles was championed by educated elites who had been raised on classical literature and demanded their governments intervene. This was all highly seductive to Cochrane, who, despite being over 50, still hungered for fame and adrenaline. After receiving a letter from the Greek Committee in London requesting him to lead the Hellenic Navy, the legendary commander readily accepted. A few complications had to be resolved first, however. Having felt swindled in South America, an exorbitant upfront payment of £37,000 was demanded by Cochrane. Furthermore, he insisted that a fleet of steam-powered warships be constructed for the campaign. Although steam technology was in its infancy in the 1820s, it had long been championed by Cochrane. Unfortunately, due to production line incompetence, none of these ships were finished in time to meaningfully impact the war, and the resulting delay in Cochrane's arrival cost the Greek revolutionaries dearly in both time and momentum. By the time Cochrane finally reached Poros on March 17, 1827, the rebellion was in a state of collapse. The Greek resistance had dissolved into internal squabbling, while the Peloponnese was being systematically ravaged by the Turks' Egyptian allies. Things began to shift the moment the Sea Wolf stepped onto the sand. Everyone was well aware of his track record against Napoleon and his exploits in South America. Consequently, his mere presence provided a massive boost to Greek morale. His influence was quickly used to unite the feuding factions, who finally agreed on Ioannis Kapodistrias as their leader. Regrettably, Cochrane's subsequent efforts in Greece were largely unsuccessful. The rapport he had enjoyed with Chilean and Brazilian sailors was never developed with the Greek crews, whom he dismissed as undisciplined and poorly trained. In truth, Cochrane had been able to build the Chilean and Brazilian navies from the ground up, whereas the Greeks already possessed a successful tradition of irregular naval warfare to which the Sea Wolf struggled to adapt. An attempt to liberate Athens by besieging the Acropolis on May 5, 1827, ended in a total rout, largely because Cochrane could not stop bickering with Richard Church, the Briton leading the Greek land forces. Thousands of Greek lives were lost due to their collective failure. From that point forward, a major role was no longer played by Cochrane in the independence struggle, though his presence did indirectly trigger the intervention of Britain, France, and Russia. These great powers eventually defeated a Turco-Egyptian fleet at Navarino in 1828, ensuring Greek sovereignty. Nevertheless, the Sea Wolf's time in Hellas is often viewed as a blemish on his otherwise stellar record. and several years were required for him to recover his shattered self-esteem. His days as a warrior were finally over. Over the following years, the British Parliament began to recognize his worth once more, and a sympathetic view toward him was adopted. Cochrane was finally pardoned for the stock fraud on May 2, 1832, and his reinstatement as a Royal Navy officer followed. With all his Napoleonic honors being returned, he was eventually promoted to Rear Admiral, though he never saw direct combat again. His remaining years were spent in semi-retirement, where his experiments with modern technology continued, and his funds were poured into the development of steam engines. Today, Cochrane is widely regarded as a pioneer of military engineering and one of the pivotal figures who navigated Britain's transition from the age of sail into the age of steam. In 1860, an extensive autobiography was penned by the elderly Sea Wolf, which has served as a primary source for this documentary. That same year, his health began to fail, and on October 31st, at the age of 85, he passed away during a risky operation for kidney stones. The legacy of the Sea Wolf continues to loom large over the nations he served. In Great Britain, he is remembered as perhaps the most audacious commander of his era, and his life has directly inspired iconic naval fiction like the Horatio Hornblower saga and Master and Commander. In Chile, his name is carried by 6 vessels, a small town, and dozens of streets, while his role in the nation's liberation is immortalized by a monument in Valparaiso. Every May, a wreath-laying ceremony is held at his grave by Chilean Navy representatives. His vital contributions to the independence of Peru and Brazil are still honored by many today. And so, the Sea Wolf's final voyage came to an end. Not with a cannon blast or the creaking of masts in a gale, but in a quiet hospital room in London. On October 31st, 1860, he was 85 years old. From the misty hills of Ansfield to the blood-soaked decks of the Speedy, from the liberating flames of Valdivia to the silent coup at Callao, from the corrupt halls of the British Admiralty to the highest honors of 3 South American nations, Thomas Cochrane lived a life that defied belief. Was he a hero? Without question, was he a troublemaker? Absolutely. Was he sometimes his own worst enemy? Undeniably, but that is what makes his story worth telling. He was never dull. He was never indifferent. He was never safe, and perhaps that is the legacy he leaves for us today. Not a list of battles won or ships captured, but a reminder that one person stubborn, brilliant, and utterly unwilling to accept injustice can change the course of history. If you enjoyed this documentary, please take a moment to like and share it with someone who loves history, adventure, or simply a good story. Subscribe to this channel and ring the bell so you won't miss our next deep dive into the lives of history's most extraordinary figures. From the History Vault, thank you for watching.